Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video. This is my first bit of Overwatch content in quite a while, so we're going to start off with what I think are really core concepts that I think should be known, but aren't always readily apparent in the game. Really understanding this stuff and implementing it has definitely improved my own personal win rate in competitive, so I hope it will do the same for you and your friends. Let's start off with the first concept, and that is that medals don't matter, kind of. One of the things that I most commonly see as a defense in games that get particularly salty is how many gold medals somebody has. Now, getting a gold medal is great, no denying that, but Overwatch is a game about making the right play at the right time to allow your team to have a breakthrough. Sure, you could have gold damage because you just spammed attacks into a Roadhog, but then he healed them, and was that actually useful for your team? My point here is that it's not about focusing on getting medals. This game isn't Call of Duty. It's about focusing on making the play that you need to make at the right time and developing the game sense to really make that your priority. Now, I'm not going to lie, this is a tricky enough thing to do. It really is something that's a pretty big effort throughout all of your gameplay. Think about it this way. You'd rather have somebody land a kill on Lucio or Mercy over that same person just kind of doing, 800 damage to 4 different targets, having it all be spread out, and then just having the enemy healers heal that up. Now, that is a little bit of a straw man argument, but I think that's a scenario that happens quite a lot when teams aren't focusing and doing damage effectively. And in that scenario, all that would have happened is the Lucio or the Mercy would have got to have charged their ult up a little bit. Take Tracer as an example. She can get loads of eliminations by peppering the enemy team, but it's far more useful to have her actually just get that one kill on an enemy's healer or somebody really important and dangerous in their back line. More often than not, getting the decisive engagement involves using your hero's toolkit in the right place rather than doing what will get you the most gold damage. It's a bit like padding your DPS in World of Warcraft. Yeah, your numbers are big, but it hasn't actually done anything. The medal system in Overwatch kind of teaches people to just try to get as high a damage or healing number as they can at the start, when in reality, winning a match is about far more than that. Next, I'm going to talk about grouping up. So going into combat one by one just feeds the enemy ult charge and it gets you killed. So what you want to do is go in as a team and make use of all of your synergy. Everyone knows this, but most of the time it only happens when one or two players tell the rest of the team that they really need to group up. So the first thing that I would recommend here is proactively being that player who is calling to the rest of the team to group up after a bad engagement. If you see someone running in on their own, it might even be just, worth asking them politely to hang back with the rest of the team. Now, often I find myself tunnel visioning, and before I know it, I've ran in without some of my team. Then I'm dead, and I feel really stupid. I've recently taken to making sure that I'm always going in with another player at my side, as a firm rule to sort of stop myself from doing that dumb stuff and feeding. Broadly speaking, I'd say there are two main ways of grouping up. The first is when your team has just been completely wiped out and everyone then groups up afterwards and heads in again. But then the other is when there's a bit of a stalemate. One or two players and each team are dying at a time, everyone's running in as soon as they spawn, and there's a group of like 3 to 5 people consistently skirmishing at the objective. It's in these scenarios that I found where waiting just a few seconds and buddying up with another player has been helpful, because we then enter the engagement together at the exact same time with the exact same information, which I find leads to better teamwork than if we had have entered the engagement, say, 5 or even 10 seconds apart. Next, we've got the idea of tunnel visioning. Coming from some other first-person shooters, it's kind of easy to tunnel vision in Overwatch. Well, when we're tunnel visioning, we're only focusing on a small amount of things, usually ourselves and the person we're trying to kill. The Mercy who's in the corner being harassed, we're not looking at her, we're just trying to land the most epic headshot in the universe or get the most clutch concussion grenade off the side of the map. It's kind of hard to stop tunnel visioning, because the problem with tunnel visioning is you don't know you're doing it when you're doing it. One way that you can sort of cut down on doing things like this is to really make a point of keeping it in your mind each time you respawn. This is a kind of like little mental, not trick, but it's something that I often do, where for the next 5 or 6 matches, I focus really on sort of improving one element of my gameplay, and every time I respawn, I just try to keep that in mind for when I next go into the engagement. And then as time goes on, that becomes a more natural process, and I find myself doing it less and less. Next, we've got the topic of damage types and really thinking about what your team has. There are a few different types of damage in Overwatch, and it really boils down to hit scan, projectile, AoE, and then the likes of, say, Maze Blaster or Winston's Tesla Gun. With projectile heroes, you shoot a physical object, it travels through the level until it hits something, be it the enemy's head or a wall. Hit scan weapons are a lot more simple. If your crosshair is on the enemy at the moment you click, then you'll get a hit. So McCree and his Peacemaker are hit scan, Hanzo and his bow are projectile. Pretty simple. And then we've got AoE thrown into the mix with the likes of Pharah. When building your comp, I generally think it's a pretty good idea to think about the types of damage that everyone is doing. Pharah can be really great for damaging the enemy, but often she struggles to finish off targets because she ends up relying a lot on direct hits, which is a bit harder to do with a sort of projectile AoE weapon like her rocket. Well, in a scenario like that, if you've got a McCree or a Soldier 76 in your team to instantly kill off those low health enemies with their hit scan weapons, then it can be a pretty good combo. These types of heroes also, broadly speaking, counter different things, and Pharah Returns is a brilliant example. She's flying around the place and therefore is really hard to hit with a projectile, since you have to think about the motion of your projectile and then the motion of the Pharah. Well, if you're using a hit scan weapon, you just click in Pharah and she's dead, problem solved. Almost all the time, the ideal way to counterpick a Pharah is to take a McCree, because that will make her life hell as soon as she jetpacks. So overall, I would recommend that you get skilled at both hit scan and projectile weaponry. It's a very transferable skill across so many of the different heroes in the game. If you're good at using, say, Zenyatta's orbs, then you'll actually also be pretty good at using Pharah's rockets. If you're good with McCree's Peacemaker, then your burst fire from Soldier's rifle will also be really accurate. Another thing that you should definitely think about is the kind of risk factor of the weapons that you're using. And I think a really good example here is the difference between, say, McCree and Soldier 76. Overall, there's more margin for error with a Soldier 76. Another good example is, say, Hanzo. A Hanzo that is basically Seagull, who's a really well-known player who's extremely accurate, does an insane amount of damage because they're so accurate. But for most players, Hanzo is really risky damage because the chance of missing is actually pretty large, and, there's those times where you miss and therefore one of your allies gets killed because you didn't end up doing your job right. So when you're thinking about your comp, if you have too many heroes that are a bit more risky, then there's a good chance that you can actually have your team fall over. So in general, I'd say it's a very good idea to have a broad sort of mix of different damage types so that you're pretty well covered across the board. Next, Overwatch is a game of ultimates. Sometimes you almost need to think of Overwatch as more of a MOBA than a shooter because of the way that ults and teamfights really kind of works when it comes to sealing the deal. Often, people are using their regular abilities and they're skirmishing about with very, very little happening in a match for a good few minutes, and then someone nails an ult and the team snowballs to a victory. That's clearly a very good thing, so a major focus of how you play Overwatch should be getting this to happen more. This is especially important if you're playing solo or duo when team coordination is at its worst. If you're the one or two people who are really trying to make these big plays happen, then you can actually win a lot more matches. The first area that we need to talk about here is team comp. It's vitally important that your team is able to synergize their ults for maximum effect. While every ult is pretty good on its own, the real match-winning potential comes from combining them, and generally that's a situation where somebody uses their ult to set up somebody else's ult, and you pretty much wipe the entire enemy team. Some excellent ults that set up other ults are Zarya's Graviton Surge, Rein's Earth Shatter, and Mei's Blizzard. Hitting one of these will easily allow somebody else in your team to decimate nearly all affected players on the enemy team, and often the difference between winning or losing a match is whether that happens once or twice. So in building your comp, ensure that somebody is able to do a big setup like this. Now in almost every game you should have either a Zarya or a Rein, so getting this bit shouldn't be too hard. One way to increase your win rate is to really start playing one of those two heroes. I'd say especially Zarya if you can get good with her, because the high impact usages of your ult will really cascade and snowball into a victory for your team. Another key part of this is knowing when to save your ult. Using it on its own to kill a random enemy is just a waste of time in comparison to saving it and then just synergizing it with the ult of one of your teammates. The good news is that you can just hit the C key and then use the callout system to tell your team when your ult is charged, and then just make a mental note of how everyone else's ult is doing. Then make sure that you're just, trying to line them up and make that a real focus of how you play the game. Playing with a friend can be a brilliant way of doing this if you choose complementary ults. For an example, being, say, one of you being a Zarya, and then somebody else being even a Genji, right? Because I had a great example earlier on where the Zarya landed a really good Graviton Surge, I was Genji, I pulled out my sword, and with the AoE, I think I killed 5 people. That was extremely effective, and it partially led to us winning that round. You also want to make sure that your team has a very good counter ult. What's a counter ult? Well, it's one that negates the ult of the enemy team. Zenyatta's Transcendence is probably the best example of this. Baiting multiple enemy ults and then using Transcendence will lead to your team pretty much being an ult ahead of the enemy, because they will have maybe sunk in 3 or 4 ults, but you just used one and pretty much escaped the whole thing. Finally, just a quick note about team comps. I don't want to give you any specific suggestions because the meta is always shifting, but generally it's a good idea to kind of go for a 2-2-2. So you got 2 damagey characters, 2 healing support characters, and then, of course, 2 tanks. But also just remember that the roles aren't necessarily the best designations of what a character is really good at. Symmetra's not a healer. Mei can actually be used in one of those tank positions in certain maps, but in general, think about having a balanced comp, and a great way to do that is think about your damage, and the point that I made about different types of damage in this video, think about that, and then think about having ults that synergize, and if you get those 2 right, you'll generally land on a pretty decent comp. And then just any specific things you need to do, like say, picking McCree if the enemy has picked Pharah so that the McCree can counter the Pharah. Just things like that. Common sense, and if you think around the different toolkits of the heroes, you should come to a pretty good conclusion with your team. But anyway, that's pretty much it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.